Okay, well, it is 1 o'clock, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Claire Crum. I am Eden's National Communications Coordinator. Before we get started, I want to make a couple notes. First thing, I'd like to note that this webinar is being recorded. It will be available on Eden's website and shared on our YouTube channel later if you would like to watch. We will have some time for Q&A following our webinar, so I ask that you hold all your questions until the end. I'm very excited to have our panelists with us this afternoon. We have Steve Sempier, Christopher Petrone, Kelsey Prahada, and Davin Holland here with us. And I think we can go ahead and get started, and Steve is going to start us off.
Very much, Claire. I appreciate it. And thank you all for joining today. I spoke with the panel earlier, and we decided to share a couple of introductory slides to set some context about Extension's role in response to chemical and oil spills. After that, I'll give you a little more details about the project that I was most closely affiliated with. So before we get too far into the, can you hear me, Claire?
She's still living with us.
Oh.
She's actually at York History Center.
Before we get too far into this,
digital programming coordinator.
Sorry, I think we're getting some feedback.
Yes, I'd ask that everybody mute themselves, please, if you are not one of our speakers.
Yeah, so she's excited
All right,
about that.
thank you, Claire. So there is a formal response process to oil and chemical spills. It starts at the national level with the National Response Team. You can see that in the upper left-hand corner here. You can see all the federal agencies that are involved in that, including NOAA, USDA, and many others. And then as you go down one layer, there's regional response plans, regional response teams. You can see what region you reside in and where you could connect if you're interested in getting more involved. And then, of course, there's a very local level. So there's area committee meetings in all the Coast Guard regions. So, for example, I gave Sector Mobile as an example that covers Mississippi, Alabama, and the Panhandle of Florida, which is where I'm located. They also have very localized plans that are developed in advance of chemical and oil spills. I also want to just point out quickly that there is a difference between a coastal spill and an inland spill as far as response goes. If it is in coastal waters, the Coast Guard is the lead for that, and scientific support is provided by NOAA. Whereas when there's an inland spill, the EPA is the lead, and they have in-house scientific support that's provided. Also wanted to point out, U.S. Department of Interior has an inland oil spill preparedness program. If you're interested in more details regarding that, you might want to check out this website. So over the last 40 years, you can see there have been quite a few spills that NOAA has responded to. They may have been there in person or providing remote support for a spill. So again, these are the ones that NOAA got tagged to be a part of. They just don't include all of the inland spills. To look at some of those, you can see this map, which is developed by the University of Arizona using some federal databases. So I guess the bottom line is you can see where your state is, and you can see there have been spills over the last 40 years. Some of those you may be familiar with, some maybe not. You can get all these details on the respective websites if you want more information. But when we often think of disasters, I think many of us, think of natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, earthquakes, even radon releases, which is a toxic form of a natural disaster. These are out of anybody's control. But there's another category of disasters considered technological disasters. This could be from mechanical failure or accident from an individual, a group, a company, or organization. Those include on the non-toxic side, things like the dam collapses, airplane crashes, explosions. But today we're going to talk about some toxic technological disasters, oil spills and chemical spills. But there are others as well that you can see. And I added one bullet, even the water crisis in Jackson, Mississippi, Flint, Michigan are examples of technological toxic disasters. The way communities respond is different depending on the type of disaster. So in natural disasters, it's nobody's fault. We can't blame a hurricane or blame a tornado and expect them to pay out for damages, for example. So often communities pull together to restore the community. People come from outside the community to help with restoration and help with community healing. There's often a time where people are pulling together to respond in a positive way. Whereas with technological disasters, because you can blame an individual, organization, company, whatever that may be, there's a lot more blame and competition for resources, demand for payouts, unfair treatment. Many community members may feel there's a reduced healing. There's no kind of closure a lot of times, because is the oil really gone? Is the chemical really gone? Whereas once the tornado leaves or the hurricane leaves, that's gone and you can fully get into recovery phase. So there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of breakdown of social relationships. And this is an important thread to think about when you look at it from an extension perspective, the response for a technological disaster versus a natural disaster. And then if you look at an individual, perspective, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I think many people might be familiar with this already, but, the bottom of this pyramid is, is the air safe to breathe? Is the food or seafood safe to eat? Is the water safe to drink? And if you are questioning those, then obviously, those are fundamental concerns that people have. So when a chemical or oil spill occurs, those are immediate questions that we get. And then this relatively new concept of allostatic load, it's been in the biological field for a while, but now has transformed over to the social science field too. But as you look at chronic stress over time, it can actually increase your new set point for your stress mediators. And that's of concern too. And especially now post-COVID, there's a lot of these stresses that are chronically repeating, and how does that change our response as individuals? So mainly I've been talking about the human side of things, but of course, when there's spills, we also think about the ecological impacts, and we can look at those at an individual level, at a population level and a community or ecosystem level. So those are all things to think about. We did identify several common traits to share. Obviously, personal connections are important. So it doesn't really matter the size of the spill. It may sound like, millions of gallons or hundreds of gallons, but if it's impacting your beach or your property or your farm or your house or your family, it's important to you. And so that's the thing that we need to keep in mind. Another thing is it's important to have connections within the community, and also with response personnel if this is an area that you're interested in providing support for. There's many phases of a spill, from response to damage assessment to restoration, and there's set processes that are involved in those phases. Unfortunately, timelines don't mesh, right? Because when an oil spill occurs, or a chemical spill, we want immediate answers, but there's a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of times the science can't answer those questions immediately. So kind of in a sprint mode and a marathon mode at the same time.
Spills cause social, economic, environmental impacts. Some are very obvious from the onset. Others you don't realize until maybe even years later. And so the mental and physical health of everybody, is of concern, whether it's the responders, the residents, even extension personnel. And that high level of uncertainty and misinformation kind of feeds this corrosive community situation. One thing we talked a lot about in 2010 after Deepwater Horizon, and even since then, this saying, facts are facts and perception is reality. And that's something that as extension, we really need to focus on as we work through a spill. And so now I'm going to share over the next few minutes a little bit more about a regional extension program I was part of after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And to get started, just wanted to share a few by the numbers. On Thursday, it'll be 13 years since the Deepwater Horizon. And a lot of times I think people forget that it was devastating in a number of ways, including 11 people died in the explosion in the aftermath of that. For 87 days, oil came out of the wellhead. You may have remembered watching on the news, seeing that constant flow of oil. Ultimately, 200 million gallons of oil were released from the wellhead. Some was captured right there at the wellhead, but approximately 200 million gallons were released. 1.7 million gallons of dispersant was used, which is a record, also applied at different places than has typically been done. And then finally, the oiled locations, a large area on the seafloor where the oil settled, and then along the shorelines, about 1,300 miles. And so you can look at the map of the 4 states that were most impacted by coastal oiling. And so Sea Grant responded with the 4 Sea Grant programs in the Gulf, had early response, including developing a peer listening training program. This was something we borrowed from our colleagues in Alaska Sea Grant and others after Exxon Valdez recognized the corrosive community situation We developed the peer listening manual modeled after what they did up in Alaska. We also engaged with fishing tourism communities. We held a number of workshops and trainings over a 4-month period, about 83 events, from dockside chats to town hall meetings. Louisiana Sea Grant had somebody in incident command feeding information from the fishing community and then back to the fishing community. We even developed a database of research activities because nobody knew what work was being done. And this is to quickly share that information. In 2010, the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative was also started. This was money set aside by BP. It was $500 million that an independent research board made funding decisions over. So BP was not involved once they set aside this money. The chair of the research board was Rita Caldwell, who was a former head of NSF, and the co-chair is the director of a major oceanographic institute at Scripps here in the US. And so their investment was in research, finding answers to a lot of these hypothesis-driven questions. But they wanted to reach beyond the scientific community. A lot of peer-reviewed papers would come out, scientific conference presentations, things like that, but they wanted to reach others. And so the research teams had to have outreach built into their proposals. They worked with a documentary team that had many documentaries already on PBS and also with the Smithsonian. And so about 2 years later, they reached out to us, the 4 Sea Grant programs, because we are a boundary organization, you know, with a science service mission, and we already had relationships with the impacted coastal groups. And finally, some peer-reviewed research was coming out that we could actually share. And so we had to reach a number of audiences across the Gulf of Mexico, and these were the ones most impacted by the oil spill, by Deepwater Horizon, and a lot of questions that came out of that, from fishing to tourism to elected officials. And so what we did was we developed an oil spill science outreach team. We hired people in 4 of the Sea Grant programs: Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. We were very purposeful with how we formed this team to be multidisciplinary so they can answer the wide swath of questions that we were getting. And so originally Chris Hale and then later Danny Bailey joined Texas Sea Grant with an ecosystem science and fisheries background. Dr. Emily Mong Douglas was at Louisiana Sea Grant, is aquatic toxicologist. Larissa Graham and later Dr. Missy Partika joined our program at Mississippi Alabama Sea Grant with the human dimensions, human health side. And then Dr. Monica Wilson joined in Florida Sea Grant, and she was an oceanographer and modeler. And so basically we were able to answer questions about what happened to the ecosystem, where did the oil go, what happened as far as toxicology, and then impacts to humans. At the bottom, Ladon Swan, he was the PI of the overall project. I led our team on the day-to-day basis, and then Tara Skelton was our communicator to help us develop products that were uniform and consistent. And so some of our early activities was earning trust. We had 33 input sessions reaching 1,200 people to ask what their oil spill science questions were. Then we developed answers to those questions using peer-reviewed research. And we were transparent with all the information we had collected, even with input sessions. We responded by developing a number of extension publications. We also had seminars and other presentations. In our seminars, we brought in scientists from federal agencies, nonprofits, universities, state agencies, NGOs, industry, to share the latest information to answer the questions that we were hearing. And then we also gave firsthand presentations. Here's a map of where we gave presentations. The green dots, and where we had seminars are the blue triangles. You can see we did this all around the country, and then obviously concentrated in the Gulf of Mexico with the target audiences we were working with. We had to stay adaptive though, as we got more input. You know, we did short videos on YouTube. We had a Science on a Sphere module. We translated some of our publications into other languages based on the audiences that we were trying to serve. And obviously, as all extension does, continue listening and responding to the input that we got. Also, as we do with extension, right, we collect a lot of metrics. So I'm not going to read through all the numbers, but you can see the types of things that we did, the number of types of extension publications with hundreds of thousands of hits. And Claire is actually going to be posting all of our publications also on the Eden website. And at the end, I'll share the website where you can access these as well. All the seminars we did, reaching more than 8,000 people, and then over 200 presentations our team gave as well. we learned quite a few lessons. Obviously, having dedicated time and effort to focus on oil spill science was a luxury. As extension, often we're juggling many different topics, and so these 4 extension specialists were able to just focus on that and on the specific audiences we were serving. And then personal relationships were key. Regular engagement with the audiences we served. Our non-advocacy role and trust was important to maintain, especially on highly contentious topics like is oil spills and is it safe for my child to go in the water or for me to eat the seafood, or what's happening to dolphins and sea turtles, things along those lines. We also tried to be as responsive as possible to the questions we were being asked, and then regular interaction. This was before COVID and everybody used Zoom, but we had to keep this regional structure going forward as an outreach team too, and stay engaged together on that. Some other lessons learned, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's still uncertainty related to Deepwater Horizon, even 13 years later. But, maintaining that story, if there is uncertainty, relaying that, and only sticking to peer-reviewed research results. That was critical in maintaining credibility and trust. A lot of times we would hear research results that hadn't been peer-reviewed yet, and we had to stay silent on that in our outreach pubs and our presentations. Eventually, they would get through the peer review and then we could share, but sometimes they didn't. So it was good that, we had to stay silent on some of that until it got through the process. We also provided platforms for diverse audiences. Like here's an example of one of our seminars. We have state and federal agencies represented, universities, natural resource managers, and others. And then finally, there's a lot of misperception, especially during, contentious issues. So we were not a BP outreach program and never were. It was actually funded through BP provided the funding to a regional alliance of governors that then funded the Sea Grant program. So we actually did not have any interaction with BP at all. We also didn't, encroach on other types of outreach activities or replace what Response was there to do. And then over time, we had to adapt our programming as other hurricanes came in and harmful algal blooms and freshwater input and other stressors. People's concerns and interests changed, and so we had to adapt to that. So that's a really quick overview. Claire, thank you for this opportunity. I want to thank all of you for joining us, and then thank all these team members that you can see in action here. I think we're going to have questions at the end. So I think, Chris, you are up next.
Yes, sir. Thank you. All right. So Steve talked about the big picture, right? The BP oil spill. We all know it. We've all familiarized ourselves with it. We all watched it happen in real time. I'm going to go a lot smaller scale. Okay. So imagine yourself in Photoshop or PowerPoint. You're going to resize your image, or you're going to grab that little corner button and shrink it. That's what I'm going to talk about is the Broadkill Beach, Delaware oil spill of 2020. Now, you most likely, unless you were in Ocean City, Maryland, Delaware, maybe Southern New Jersey, you maybe heard about this, probably not because of the scale, but I'll lead into sort of why this is a bigger deal and how Delaware Sea Grant responded. And so thank you to Claire and Steve for the invitation to present today. I look forward to sharing my information. So just for, again, sense of sort of context, there's Delaware. Most of you have probably never been to Delaware. Some of you maybe have driven through it. You can see the I-95 corridor there running through just the top of Delaware. That's usually people's interaction with the state, which is okay. But so there we are. You see Delaware Bay there as a entrance from the Atlantic Ocean, runs up to Philadelphia, and there's actually a canal that runs about, I can't really see it here, but it runs from the Delaware Bay to Chesapeake Bay as a major shipping thoroughfare as well. And so why is this important? Why is Delaware Bay important? It happens to be the #1 largest population of horseshoe crabs of any of the 4 current species on the globe. We have the highest population here in Delaware Bay. Why do I bring this up? This is important ecologically. It is also important from a human standpoint in terms of their blood. I'm not going to get into horseshoe crab blood now, but if you're interested, go Google it. But it has major ecological, and environmental, and economic impacts having those horseshoe crabs here in Delaware. So those beaches that they come up to spawn in along the Delaware Bay, vitally important, particularly between April and June. Tourism is another big driver here in Delaware and New Jersey for that matter. You can see there, Delaware beaches, around 7.5 million people come to our beaches in the summertime, about 2.5 million in the shoulder seasons on either side of the summer. Ocean City, Maryland, which is to our south, about 8 million annually. And Cape May County, which is up to our northeast, is about 10 million annually. So a lot of people come to this small portion of the world for all sorts of reasons, including tourism. During the summer and throughout the year. This is not an area without incidents, right? This nothing necessarily on the magnitude of the BP oil spill, but this is from NOAA's Office of Response and Restoration map. These aren't all gas and oil, obviously. There was a barge that got struck by lightning last summer, 2 summers ago. So that's on here, but there are concerns in this region, particularly up in the sort of the Delaware River portion of the estuary up into Philadelphia. And this is why we have a ton of refineries up in that northern Delaware into Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And you can see some of those listed here. The Delaware River Port Complex, which encompasses, all these different ports, not just gas and oil and refineries, but cargo ports, those kinds of things, is the number one. And some of you may contest this. I don't know. I found it, it's from a pretty reliable source, the number one freshwater port in the world. And so you can see some of our stats there: 190,000 jobs, $85 billion in economic activity. But the bigger piece of this is about 1 million barrels of oil move through Delaware Bay every day, which is just a staggering number. And most of the people, you can't see it out my back window here, but Delaware Bay is right out my back window. And most people have no idea how much oil is transported through Delaware Bay every day. Though I'm not talking about these spills in particular, but we have had some larger spills in our history in Delaware Bay and River. And I've listed them here. I'm not going to read those to you. But growing up in Philadelphia, right, which is right on the Delaware River, in some of these timeframes, I never knew any of this. I had no idea that these things happened 5-10 miles from me growing up, which is kind of interesting, but shows a bigger issue here about oil transfer, oil offloading in Delaware River and Delaware Bay. If you're interested, you can visit our website. It has our whole oil spill, a lot of oil spill information. Focusing this talk on the Broadkill Beach oil spill of 2020, right? So this happened in the fall. Again, if this would have happened during the summer season, the tourist season, this could have been a lot more catastrophic from an economic standpoint. If it happened during April, May, June, it would have had a huge environmental impact on horseshoe crabs. But this happened, if you're going to have an oil spill, this is kind of a good time to have it, apparently. So October, November of 2020, you can see the map there covers from the star there indicates Broadkill Beach, Delaware. It extended, we found oil was found as far south as Assateague, Virginia. And so you can see there about 87 miles. Obviously, the response was from, as Steve mentioned earlier, the U.S. Coast Guard and Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control. Was also assisted by Tri-State Bird Rescue and Research and the Murr Institute, which handles marine mammals in the state of Delaware. So Steve's big millions of gallons of oil, we had 215 gallons, right? So about 5 barrels of oil was found along the beach, originally in Broadkill, and eventually expanded to that 87 miles. It was a high aromatic heating or diesel fuel oil. About 85 tons of oil debris was cleared from beaches. Fortunately, I contacted Southern Delaware Tourism, a couple of chambers of commerce in the area, no reported economic impact, which is, again, huge. If this would have happened in July or August, this would have been a completely different story. The source of the oil to this day is still unknown. It was found, it's been fingerprinted, it's been tested by a whole host of organizations, and the source was never identified. So obviously no one can ever be fined, those kind of things. So as Delaware Sea Grant, what can we do? We are not first responders, right? We are not the Coast Guard. We are not DENREC. So what can we as Delaware Sea Grant do? We have never responded, to my knowledge, to an oil spill. I listed a bunch there. Delaware Sea Grant was certainly around during those times. I don't know of any response at those times. And again, a lot of that was pre-internet. And so no social media, no websites, those kinds of things that we really harnessed for the Broadkill spill. So you can see here some of our social media that we were able to put out. Our role wasn't to go clean up oil, identify oil, clean up birds, those kinds of things. Our role, and I learned this from our colleagues in the Gulf states that did an amazing job with the BP oil spill. Our goal, our response was to amplify, right? Take those messages that were being put out by DNREC, by the Coast Guard, and get them to a larger audience. So you can see some of our communications efforts. We do, for those that maybe know Sea Grant, you've heard of 15-second science, hopefully. We have a series of short videos, obviously 15 seconds in length, about 250, 275 episodes of these that just real quick and dirty snapshots of science, covering all sorts of topics. We decided to go all in and do a 7-day series all about oil, so you can see some of the topics there. And we're also able to do a fair amount of outreach to classrooms, local classrooms here in Eastern Sussex County, Delaware. We're reaching out saying, hey, our kids want to know about what's going on. And so we provided a fair number of classroom outreach by Zoom because it was during COVID. And so a lot of the schools were working remotely. And so we were able to provide those via Zoom. And you can see some of that image there. We did put out a small RFP. So Delaware Sea Grant has, most programs have a small pot of money that are able to fund very small projects, $10,000 or less. So we put out a rapid response call for small scale research. We did fund Dr. Art Trembanis to do some side scan sonar work along the Broadkill Beach to see if he came across any oiled sediment. Dr. Trembanis has done a lot of side scan sonar work in this area. And so we had oil spill scans already, and so went back and did another set of scans, and fortunately found no oiled sediment right there off Broadkill Beach. We were able to serve as a connector, right? We were able to take university scientists, university experts, and connect them, liaison with media outreach, those kinds of things. We had reporters calling, newspapers, a whole host of people wanting to know more about the oil spill. We were able to connect some of our experts with the papers and news stations and things. So lessons learned, I've learned that top bullet there is a critical one. I learned that from the oil spill science outreach team in the Gulf. Make the connections before you need them. Emily Mong Douglas, who was with Louisiana Sea Grant, is now with Delaware Sea Grant. Taught a workshop at our Mid-Atlantic Regional Sea Grant meeting a few years ago, and essentially said you shouldn't be meeting these people that you're going to be working with around an oil spill, around a hurricane, whatever the case may be, for the first time at the spill. You should already know these partners. You should already have their names, have their contact, and have a relationship. You shouldn't be meeting for the first time at the spill or whatever the event may be. Having a generalized response plan. There are so many things that could happen here in Delaware, in Minnesota, Florida, wherever you may be, that can go wrong. And so having a more generalized plan, you can't plan detailed for everything. And so having a generalized response plan of how you might react, how your program might react to a certain event is always helpful. Fall back to what you know. That's what we did. We knew 15-second science. We knew social media. And that's where we sort of tried to help the cause. Tried not to reinvent the wheel, right? We're extending messages from DNREC and the Coast Guard and amplifying those messages to our own followers. And then obviously reflect and evaluate, figure out what did we do right? What did we do that could have been better? Those kinds of things. And finally, just some resources if you're interested in the Delaware Sea Grant Oil Spill website, which includes the 15-second science episodes. Those previous spills that I mentioned, the Corinthos, Athos 1, those are all on our oil spill timeline, which provides links to more information. And then you can see the front page of our oil spill FAQ here on the right. And I just want to give more shout out, more props to Steve and his squad in the Gulf of Mexico, because they were just a tremendous help from things resources they had already put out that we could utilize, and just from the advice and things that they had to offer during our sort of time of need here in Delaware. So with that, thank you all very much. Happy to answer questions at the end of the panel.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. Next, we are going to hear from Kelsey.
Hello, everyone. I'm just going to pull my screen up here. Okay, so my name is Kelsey Prihota, and I'm with Minnesota Sea Grant, and I'm going to kind of switch gears a little bit. I'm not going to be talking about a specific incident that occurred. My intention today is to really talk about more generally about what hazardous materials are, how they're transported, why they're transported, and then share a little bit with you all about the Hazardous Material Transport Outreach Network, or HAZMATON. And we are a network that extends from Duluth, Minnesota, where I'm located, all the way through the Great Lakes region and Lake Champlain, as well as into the Hudson River. And tell you a little bit about resources that we have and how we can help support extension work. So in July 25th, 2010, during a flood event, a discharge of heavy crude oil occurred from a 30-inch pipeline rupture of Enbridge Line 6B. This release was estimated by Enbridge to be 843,000 gallons. It entered the Talmadge Creek, which is a tributary of the Kalamazoo River, in Marshall, Michigan, and the floodwaters distributed the oil along Talmadge Creek into the Kalamazoo River, as well as its backwaters, its floodplains, islands, wetlands. And this photo shows response operations near the source of the spill on Talmadge Creek about 6 days later. And this was one of the largest land-based releases of crude oil. Cleanup for this would take 4 years. This photo shows a more recent incident. This is the Norfolk Southern train derailment that occurred on February 3rd, 2023 in East Palestine, Ohio. The train was carrying 20 placarded hazardous materials tank cars, transporting combustible liquids, flammable gases, including vinyl chloride, and cleanup efforts are still underway at the derailment site. One of the things that I really want you to take away from this talk today is that hazardous materials really touch our everyday lives. They're ubiquitous in our economy. They are transported in almost every way imaginable throughout almost every corner of the United States. The vast majority of the time, this transportation goes unnoticed. And it's not until an accident or incident occurs that people start to think about what's being transported and why. One role that extension can play is to ensure that people are thinking about hazmat transportation and spill preparedness and response in those other times. What's moving, how much is moving, how emergency responders are preparing for this, what impacts would occur if an incident were to happen, and moreover, what is the inherent risk with one form or mode of transport over another? So if a pipeline were to be shut down and oil had to be transported via truck, what risks would that carry versus a pipeline transport? So things like that. There are many different definitions of hazardous materials. This term can mean many different things to many different people. This is the U.S. Department of Transportation definition: substances capable of posing an unreasonable risk during when transporting in commerce. But if you're the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, you're defining it as a health hazard or physical hazard. These can be things like carcinogens, toxic agents, irritants, corrosives. If you're EPA, you're thinking about any item or chemical that can cause harm to people, plants, or animals. And if you are the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, you're thinking about ionizing radiation. So again, many different definitions here. We transport hazardous materials in several ways: truck, rail, vessel, airplane, pipeline. And the reason that we do that is because these are widely used commodities and products. So these can be industrial and agricultural chemicals like pesticides, fertilizers, compressed gases, and acids. These can be common household and consumer products like paints, adhesives, batteries, swimming pool chemicals. crude oil and their refined products like gasoline, propane, grease, wax, asphalt. These are ubiquitous in our national economy. These are used by industry, they're used by us as consumers, they're used by businesses. And for those who aren't part of a formal spill response network, like Chris had mentioned, we don't normally think about the transport and about what could happen if an incident were to occur. It happens largely sort of out of sight, out of mind. There's a lot of words on this on this slide, but this is an introduction to the Hazardous Material Outreach Network. In 2010, there was increasing domestic production of crude oil in the United States, and that trend continues today. This increasing domestic production put a lot of pressure on the dominant form of transportation, which was pipelines. And so increasingly, crude oil was being transported by rail and by truck. And this was more noticeable to people. And so in 2014, a regional extension program began with a commitment from the Great Lakes Sea Grant Network directors to examine the social, economic, and environmental impacts. They were known at that time as Crude Move, and they were very focused on crude oil. Had a couple of workshops in 2015, bringing people together and looking at key issues and research needs. In 2017, they partnered with the International Joint Commission and the Great Lakes Commission to host a big symposium that looked at transportation, infrastructure, economics, hazards, and risks of crude oil transportation in the Laurentian Great Lakes region. I came along in August of 2021 and again from Minnesota Sea Grant began to coordinate the group. We had a rebranding effort in 2022 and expanded our scope to include all hazardous materials transportation and have been expanding our membership as well. And you can see this map here. The little blue dots are where our members are physically located. And around the outside, these are the member organizations that make up our network at this time. Really what I like to, when I describe our network, the way that I describe it is we sort of work at the intersection between extension professionals and emergency managers and regulators and scientists. So emergency managers who wish that residents, business owners, and other interests in their communities knew about work ahead of an incident, the work that they do ahead of an incident. Regulators who wish that scientists were doing research to fill a data gap that would help them in their policy and decision making. Scientists who wish the research that they did could more easily get into the hands of emergency responders and regulators to be applied. And extension professionals like us who want to know where to start, where to get more information, want a venue to share about what's happening on a regional basis. That's who we are, where we work, who we work with. I just want to share a few resources with you all. Our website is hazmaton.org. We have information on a few of the dominant forms of transportation within the Great Lakes, Laurentian, Great Lakes region. This is a photo of a map that's on our site that shows pipelines. We have similar information for rail and vessel and truck. And for each of those modes of transportation, we talk a little bit about pros and cons, inherent hazards, reasons why that form of transportation is dominant for certain things. We also have a resource library that we'll be working on updating in the coming years. This has information, government produced documents, as well as peer-reviewed publications on forms of transportation, and that's specific information for the Laurentian Great Lakes region. Then we also have a quarterly newsletter we put out called the Hazmaton Quarterly. This has information about some of the work that our members are doing. So we have the NOAA Scientific Spill Coordinator for the Great Lakes, who has a regular column. We have the Great Lakes Oil Center of Expertise for oil spills, and they have a regular column. We provide information about regional events that are happening and current events, as well as publications that have come out that are, again, really specific to the region that we work in, Laurentian Great Lakes. We like to say that we started to do webinars before they were cool. We have archived on our webinars going back to 2016, when we started a summer webinar series on our site. Again, these are topics that are affecting the Great Lakes region. So if you're located in this region, this is a good place to start looking at information. This one that we had last year, Fueling the Laurentian Great Lakes, is a good one to get sort of an overview perspective of kind of how people are thinking about just where oil is flowing, as well as economic and social and environmental impacts. So our work really focuses on 4 things: emergency response planning. So we recently attended the No Spills Conference. This was an opportunity for us to connect to emergency managers, let them know who we are, what we do, where we work. We also are involved with Region 5 Regional Response Team, attending those meetings, finding out more about what they're doing and responses that have happened in the area where we work. One of the areas that we want to do more work in over the next couple of years is ecological impacts of spills in freshwater environments. We have a session upcoming in May at the International Association for Great Lakes Research about oil spill impacts in a changing climate. So that's happening soon. We meet as a group monthly, and in that way, we're sharing things about what's happening locally where we are, and sort of have a big picture of how things are moving, where things are moving, what's happening in and around our region, all the way from the western Lake Superior to the Hudson River. And then in the future, we want to work more in the space of economic and social impacts of hazardous material transportation. One of the things that we would really like to do is to do some work assessing the socioeconomic vulnerability of lakeshore communities to oil spills, focusing in on a smaller geographic location to start, and expanding from there. So importantly, how can extension professionals be more involved? I think the best piece of advice that I can offer is to start where you are. So spill response planning and preparedness happens on a local level. And so this shows the EPA regions that Steve showed on his slides. Within each of these EPA regions, you may have an area committee, a local area committee, which is really a subgroup that works on a very small geography. It's comprised of local emergency responders and other stakeholders. And that is a really good place to investigate, find out if there's a local area committee where you work, and see if you can get more involved. Another thing that I could suggest is to take an introduction to the incident command system training course. These are offered by FEMA. They're Emergency Management Institute. They are a couple of hours long. They're interactive, they're web-based, so that it's an easy place to start when you're starting to think about what is this emergency response thing. And I can put a link to the chat to that in the chat after. Attending a No Spills conference for those who are located in the Great Lakes region, in the Midwest, that would be a really great way to learn about response work that's been happening in your area, and to really get a little bit more information and education. But I also wanted to point out that there are a lot of challenges facing extension professionals working in this area. I think that outreach on hazardous materials transportation is very unique. As extension professionals, we really want to educate without creating anxiety and fear and confusion. And so that's why we try to have really diverse memberships. We're speaking to really diverse audiences. So really outreach needs to be done in coordination with emergency managers, researchers, representatives from industry, before an incident occurs. So echoing what Chris had said in his presentation, and forming relationships with these collaborators can sometimes be difficult. This is information that's not always publicly available. Where things are moving within the country isn't always publicly available information. And it can be a very sensitive topic, but it's a topic that's very important because it touches everyone's lives. And so really our group is sticking to those principles of Sea Grant, data-driven, honest brokers of science, non-advocacy, and that's the way that we believe that we can build trust among our collaborators. So this is my last slide. This is just a few ways that you can get connected with my group, Hazardous Material Transport Outreach Network. Again, our website, my email information, and then email listserv. So I can put all of this in the chat as well. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Kelsey. And last, we're going to hear from Davin.
Great, thank you. And we're running behind, so I want to leave time for questions. So I'm going to keep this really short. So this will be a little bit different. I just wanted, this is a paper that was done for the International Oil Spill Conference. So I will provide a link to the organizers so that you can, if you want more information, you can read it. But my name is David Holland. I'm a Coastal Community Resilience Specialist for Alaska Sea Grant. And I also serve on the Scientific Advisory Committee for the Prince William Sound Regional Citizens Advisory Council, which I'll just mention near the end. But that is a organization. There are 2 advisory councils in Alaska that were formed after the Exxon Valdez oil spill. And I just want to acknowledge I'm calling from Anchorage on Dena'ina Health-Nena, Dena'ina territory on the landscape in which I'm from and where I live and work. So as an Alaskan, I remember very well on March 24th, 1989, when I learned about the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Prince William Sound. And little did I know that I would be working in the aftermath of impacts of that oil spill on and off over my career. During college, I worked at a law office in downtown Anchorage. I filed away case notes for plaintiffs who had been impacted by EVOS. I skimmed each one to ensure it was going to the right file, correct order. But these were stories of lives disrupted, impacts of health, society, and a way of life, but mostly stories of loss. Many years later, I still remember some of those stories. In 2004, as an early career anthropologist, I traveled to Prince William Sound to administer harvest assessment surveys in Cordova and Chenega Bay. We asked questions about the disruption of the subsistence way of life, about the loss of passing on traditions, and how life had changed. And in 2015, I was back in Cordova to administer the same survey. During that second visit, I spent time doing in-depth interviews with community members who could tell me about how life had changed for the community of Cordova. Following Deepwater Horizon spill, the awareness about profound technological disasters impact local communities and economies became more evident. We learned from EVOS and Deepwater Horizon that although you can never prepare a community for an oil spill, you can learn to mitigate it, the actual impacts of it. So in 2017, the Gulf Research Program started to look at health and the impacts on economies and the social way of life. And I participated in that. And the outcome of that was to provide recommendations on what projects could be done to address health, social, and economic impacts. And we had a series of workshops that involved the Sea Grant Oil Spill Science Outreach Program that Steve already talked about, Alaska Sea Grant, the University of California Sea Grant, and Virginia Sea Grant. And we were focusing on public health, social disruptions, and economic impacts from spills. And so we held a workshop in Anchorage to look at some of the major impacts here in Alaska. We really tailored this for Alaska. Alaska has a highly diverse environment with real operational challenges. We are America's Arctic state. The population too is really diverse. And just to kind of give you, the subsistence way of life is really important here. Just to give you an example, in Prince William Sound, the average person harvests 184 pounds of wild food per year. In the Arctic or Western Alaska, that can be up to 425 pounds of wild food per year. So this is the area that we focused on. We looked at subsistence economies, commercial fishing, and the health and social impacts of spills. We tried to keep really consistent questions with other workshops that were going on around the country. So there were those other workshops that I briefly mentioned. And so we had some down like Houma, Louisiana. There were ones in California, and we tried to keep really consistent questions, but figuring in the factor that Alaska is also very unique. And so, here's an example. This is Chenega Bay Boat Harbor in Prince William Sound. The Copper River fishery is one of the earliest wild salmon fisheries in the state of Alaska. And prior to the Exxon Valdez oil spill, people could make a living just fishing in Prince William Sound. And here, this is a stark reminder that this boat harbor here in Chenega Bay is completely empty of fishing boats. Today, you can no longer make it a living because of the loss of the herring fishery. That was the outcome of EVOS. And so these really impacted communities in the area. This is Cordova, where we still do have a fishery, a salmon fishery, but a lot of people have to do other jobs and do other type of things throughout the year. They can no longer make a living just being fishermen. This is also an example of how things have changed. These are harvest assessments that were done in Chenega Bay over the years. It's one of the best data sets. And you can see that after the Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989, things changed, and also the composition of harvest changed. So the way of life really never went back to the way it was. So one of the things that we focused on is looking at other areas of Alaska, the Bering and Chukchi Seas, for example. These are areas where people harvest and use wild resources. And you can see that across all of Western Alaska, and this is not all of communities, this is only 29, that wild resources are being harvested everywhere. And so this is one of the basic summary is that, that there are other areas of the states. The Bering Sea is one of the areas that we're most concerned about. There is a lot of ship traffic that is going through there now. There's a loss of sea ice. And so we really focused on trying to think about those areas of Alaska where we might have the next spill and how communities need to be involved. And so finally, I just wanted to say that one of the real benefits of this is we brought in some elders from the Bering Sea, and we really worked on trying to think about co-production of knowledge and how essential that is in research, and really understand the subsistence way of life, the values of local and traditional knowledge, and how communities feel about being the first line of response in incidents, and how, especially in Alaska, there are few federal resources available like there are in the rest of the country to actually address these incidents. So finally, I just wanted to mention that as part of my work with the Prince William Sound Regional Citizens Advisory Council, we have the Coping with Technological Disasters user-friendly guidebook you can find on the website. That's been recently updated. We spent about 3 or 4 years updating that, modernizing it, thinking about the way that we deliver information today. And then we are also working on a peer listener training update. That is also something that Mississippi Alabama Sea Grant did, and we're trying to take what they did and try to improve our own way in which we deliver that kind of training so we can deal with mental health issues following a spill. And so with that, I'll leave it, and I think we're going to have some questions. Thank you.
All right, yes, thank you. So we are going to open up the floor for some Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. You can drop them in the chat as well, and I can read them if that is easier. Well, I know we had a question that we wanted to ask originally. Wanted to ask if anyone here has experience with oil spills or chemical spills themselves, and if they have anything they would like to share. Oh, yes, and there are a couple links in the chat box as well. So I know Kelsey and Dave and both have dropped some in there. Thank you.
So I guess I have a question for Steve. I'd mentioned I admired their work for years and appreciated their work and all the resources they put out. Looking back, Steve, are there things that your program, the Gulf of Mexico program, would have done differently given another spill? You know, oh, we could have done this a little bit better. We could have changed that.
That's a great question, Chris. I think, we were fortunate that we were able to bring on a large team relatively quickly once the program, started, which was great. I wish we had more opportunities to engage since we were distributed across 5 different states. I think if we were able to engage more directly together, I think that would have been helpful on the onset, just coordinating a regional extension program. But that we couldn't necessarily do. But I think, that early engagement with the people we were trying to serve was critical. And I think that's one strength. I know that's one strength that the Sea Grant Extension Network and Land Grant Extension has. When somebody comes on board, we're able to magnify their reach by working with their colleagues within the Sea Grant programs. I do want to kind of make a shout out for Texas Sea Grant, Louisiana Sea Grant, Florida Sea Grant, Mississippi, Alabama Sea Grant for helping get them started right away, finding the community leaders and things like that. I think that if we hadn't have done that, I think that would have been a kind of a fatal flaw in a lot of ways. But that's a good question, Chris. I'll have to think a little more about that as well.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No, it's great. I think the other piece is anticipating, over time, interest kind of fades, and how do you modify, your programming to still address the prominent questions without, like David was saying, there's still discussions about Exxon Valdez. Now we're 25 years later almost. So anyway, so it's interesting to be adaptive as other disasters occur.
I have a question for David. So you had mentioned the workshops that you did one was in Louisiana, one's in Anchorage, Alaska. There were others as well. One of the things I was wondering, because you had this similar set of questions that you're asking, and I was wondering, did you get different responses based on the geography where the workshop was held, or were people answering the questions in a similar way? So like geography didn't really matter.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think things were just a little different in Alaska, just because we have the inability really to respond in a lot of locations. And the fact that our communities will be first responders. And they do place response equipment around the state, and local community members are trained to do that. But I think the one thing I wanted to mention is that the social impact, there are a lot of similarities, for example, between Western Alaska and Southern Louisiana. Importance of fisheries, large-scale oil infrastructure, subsistence economies, indigenous communities. So there's all these similarities. And so you actually do see that, or communities that are really focused on fisheries and that impact. So I definitely think, there are some similarities in certain areas. But yeah, in terms of response, though, it's very different here, and we have to recognize the fact that our communities will probably have to be the first responders.
All right, I think it's Audie has raised her hand.
Yeah, hi. I have a question for Chris. When you were doing the outreach on the Broadkill beach oil spill, did you get connected with emergency managers? Like, did you work closely with them? And if so, how did you make the connection with these people?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. So interestingly, I guess about a year prior to the Broadkill Beach, a little bit more than a year prior to the Broadkill Beach spill, I had gotten invited to an incident exercise up in Paulsboro, New Jersey, one of the major refineries up in New Jersey. And it was through Emily Mong Douglas and the Gulf of Mexico crew got me invited to this exercise where it was a tabletop exercise on a 1,000,000-gallon spill 30 nautical miles off of the coast of Delaware and New Jersey, right? So a huge spill, peak tourist season, and what happens next. And so through that exercise, I was able to make some connections and meet some folks from Department of Natural Resources and the Coast Guard, local Coast Guard station, to facilitate some of that work a year and change later. So again, back to those best practices, having at least a handshake, an invitation or an introduction to these emergency responders well beforehand is so critical. So I was able to say, hey, blah, 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 I met you in Paulsboro back in July, I'm trying to do this. And it helped, it greased the wheels big time, because I was able to make those connections a lot faster than if it was just cold calling. Hey, I'm Chris Patrone from Delaware Sea Grant. I want to do this stuff. And they would have been ignored. So I was able to make those connections, reestablish those connections after an initial introduction.
All right, any other questions? Yeah, Megan.
Hi there. So my question would be, I know in the first presentation, you were talking about one of the keys to response, and it's something I've seen coming from an area with a lot of natural disasters, is keeping everybody on the same page right from the gate, so the people aren't providing conflicting information or non-peer reviewed information. So knowing when to be quiet, when to actually provide that science that's coming out. What would you say would be, maybe the top 3 key points to orchestrating that or, making sure that everyone's staying on the same page? I've seen a lot of issues with that, even just communication between FEMA and the community, not even bringing extension into it. So what would be some pointers you'd have for that process, or what's really worked for you?
Maybe, do you want me to start? And then I'm sure David and Kelsey and Chris can add to that too. I think, we would work with the public information officers, part of the formal structure of response. And they may say something, or have somebody from the Coast Guard say something in the microphone that may or may not be believed, because they, at least for Deepwater Horizon, they were rotating so many people through from all over the country. So they'd be there for a short term and then move on. Well, if we had one of our Sea Grant Extension people say the same exact things, it would be believed by the fishing community, because they've worked for them for decades, versus this kind of stranger in a uniform, or maybe not in a uniform, saying that same message. And so I think that trust, and like what Chris was saying, building those bridges with those, incident command people, the area committees early on, is important before the spill comes. So having that, because a lot of times ever since that happened, there were many other spills in the Gulf of Mexico. You all saw the map. And so right away, people are thinking Deepwater Horizon, fisheries closures, et cetera. We could then go directly to our scientific support coordinator at NOAA, say, okay, can you tell us what's going on with the spill, this current spill? And they'll give us the update directly, which sometimes that information is a lot more contemporary than what's actually being fed out there. And so by keeping those lines of communication was critical. I don't know if I totally answered your question, Megan, but I think having that trust early and before, and spending a time, it's usually about a half a day, quarterly, half a day, twice a year, going to area committee meetings. And it's interesting because they're talking about all different kinds of events that have occurred, and just starting to socialize yourself there is great. But I'll be quiet because there might be other comments Chris, Kelsey, David may want to add too.
David, Kelsey, or Chris, anything you want to add at this time?
I mean, just from where we sat on the very small spill, it was giving DNREC, Department of Natural Resources, and the Coast Guard the ability to say something first, because we were hearing things too, right? Local news is trying to break things, and you just sort of let that ride and say, I'm waiting for the Coast Guard to say something, and then we would amplify that message. But yeah, sort of, you want to get the right information out, and because, again, this is a very small spill, but things were changing, right? oh, it's shown up in Ocean City, Maryland. It showed up in Virginia. So it was like we were waiting to hear, you know, from a reliable source before we said anything.
I also think that any training, education, awareness that we can provide about to our communities about what this response incident command system response network is prior to something happening is really beneficial, because it's very nebulous and very difficult, I think, to understand. And I think that's one area that extension professionals that are really good at doing that is like taking that really hard to understand thing and communicating it to our communities.
And I'll just say the last thing is that, you know, Sea Grant is our trusted sources of information. And so we do have to follow that incident command, but then just like, you know, Kelsey just said, then we can get that out to the communities. And most of our agents, like here in Alaska, are actually embedded in coastal communities. And so they are trusted sources of information.
And to build on what Chris said too, you know, we were battling the Anderson Coopers of the world that's going to get anybody who's willing to speak on CNN, for example. And so, you know, we couldn't fall into that trap of just listening to anybody. You know, it's got to be the vetted information.
Right. Thank you, Megan, for your question. A question we did speak about earlier was the difference in response between land grant institutions and then Sea Grant programs. So David, Kelsey, Chris, Steve, if any of you would like to add anything to that, or anybody else in the crowd would like to share their thoughts. Oh, Audie, you raise your hand again.
It's a different question, so I can wait.
I would say, you know, when and I forget when I reached out, whether it was related to the oil spill or not. Our cooperative extension group, we work with them. We're not related. Some Sea Grant programs are directly related to their land grant programs. We are not. We work with them a bunch. We collaborate on various projects, but we're not one and the same. I reached out and asked about oil and spills and those kinds of things. And they had someone who, I guess, kind of like what I was doing with oil spills, is they have someone that sort of dabbles in inland system spills, but it's, you know, again, here in Delaware, it's few and far between. That person, I think, was getting ready to retire, so it wasn't really on their radar too much. I don't know if that's changed, particularly in light of recent inland spills and trains derailments and things. But I will definitely follow up as a result of this workshop.
In the Gulf, it was all hands on deck. So, you know, whether it was AgriLife or Cooperative Extension, they kind of tackled some different topics. So seafood safety and food safety in general was a top priority. And I think, well, I know there was a lot of expertise within Cooperative Extension. So some of the workshops and things we had in 2010, when, I don't know if you remember, people smelling fish and all that kind of stuff as part of the testing process, which had its own set of misperceptions too. But Cooperative Extension, for example, that's a very discrete example, but they were heavily involved in helping with the messaging and the training of the seafood testing process and training the fishing industry too, to understand how that is. So that's really discrete. But I think also, you know, whether it's a county agent or a specialist too, there's absolutely a role, because once it happens in your county or your area, you're going to get questions no matter what. So the more you're prepared ahead of time, it's just trying to carve out with all your programming, how do you find the niche to get time to work in this area too, or at least make those relationships.
Okay, Audie.
Yeah, thank you. When you do outreach after an oil spill event, do you have in mind, was there some very big misconceptions that people had that you can think of?
in terms of Delaware spill, we had to not battle, but people were really interested in getting out there and seeing the oil and helping, right? They wanted to help. People wanted, and obviously we were getting a handful of emails and calls about what can we do? How can we help? And it's really hard to tell someone to stay away, right? Just let the first responders do what they know how to do, what they're trained for. If you're walking on a beach and you see oil, absolutely report it, right? That's the number one. Just report it. Don't touch it. Don't try to smell it. Don't try to touch it. Just take a picture, make a call, whatever, and back away. So that was really the number one sort of question we got was, what can we do? How do we help?
In the Gulf, you know, the application of dispersants was very controversial. And I think just the thought of adding more chemicals to technological disaster to the environment, you know, obviously sparks a lot of concern. There was a lot of belief that at night planes are flying, applying dispersants right here on the coastline. There's a lot of rules and regulations why that can't happen. But it went even further to the point where people were saying there's some common chemicals in some of the dispersants that were used in X-Lax. And so one of the big things was that you can't eat anything anywhere because it's going to have the same chemical that's in X-Lax, and you're going to have, you know, health problems because of that as well. So kind of messaging some of that. Another slippery slope too is like PAHs. That's in oil products. But down here in the Gulf, we love barbecue, and eating a pulled pork sandwich or a barbecued chicken, whatever, that's got a tremendous amount of PAHs in it. And not trying to start making parallels. Well, if you're eating chicken, you shouldn't be worried about, and smoking a cigarette, you shouldn't be worried about PAHs in oil, because you can't, making those bridges isn't going to be helpful for anybody. But, you know, that's another area that's controversial.
Claire, it's Fred. I have a question if we still have time.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. So the one thing that I learned, I don't work with you folks directly, but I have been involved with oil spills, cleanups, pesticide spills, ran a government agency with cleanups and all that. So there's one thing about teaching people when you have no experience. And this is the part, by reading a paper and talking about it is not the same with being there and seeing and smelling and feeling. And so that seems to be, at least from what I know, to be a weak point. But the strong point I hadn't thought about, which would seem to me to be a graphic that would talk about the after effects. And I think I saw Davin was talking about people, and we heard about fisheries, and we heard about food safety, and we heard about water quality, we heard about birds, and we heard the economy. I think that's an area that should be promoted, that we may not be able to have access to the cleanup and being on site, if that's true, but we have all of these other resources that we have people that are able to speak on with some authority, right? So I guess that was my comment, as 32 years in extension, that is my comment of what I learned today. It's these outside pieces that we can bring in to extension that goes beyond just the cleanup and the process and who's doing what to who. So I guess that's more of a comment than a question, and I'll leave it at that for whatever it's worth.
Thank you, Fred. Right. Any more questions or comments? Okay, well, I don't want to take up any more of anyone's time this afternoon, but feel free to reach out to me with any follow-up questions you might have, or to any of our speakers. I'm sure they'd be happy to answer any questions you think of later. Please check your emails. I will be sending out a link to a quick survey if you could take. We really value everyone's feedback on the webinars that we present. And I just want to say thank you so much to our speakers today, Chris, David, Steve, and Kelsey. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. This was very informative. I've learned a lot, and hopefully everyone else has as well. Any other notes before we go?
Claire, will the recording be available on the website? Or?
It will be. I will put it on Eden's website. We have a webinar page where you can find all of our past webinars and in our YouTube channel. So feel free to look on our website later this afternoon for it.
Thanks, Claire.
Yep,
Thank
thanks for the
you.
opportunity.
Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Steve and
We
Chris,
good?
thank
Thanks,
you
Claire.
both.
Yep, thank you. And I think, are we going to connect about the assembly at some point? I
Yes.
think we still have a few more weeks for that one.
Yes, I think May 5th is our, what am I trying to say? Presentation day.
Yes,
We'll
okay.
meet with them, yeah. And if
Just
you want
let
to
me
meet,
know. Oh, sorry.
yeah, a quick meeting before then would probably be good just to do some review. I've made a new updated Eden 101 PowerPoint that we can incorporate. So just have to talk a little bit more about what else we want to share.
Awesome. Well, good deal. Yeah, just let me know if you and Bill or, Chris, if you want to join this part too, playing the assembly call too. But thank you for joining, Chris. I know I twisted your arm a little bit, but
It's all good. It's all good. Always happy to be alongside you, Steve.
All right, good deal.
Thanks, all.
All right,
care.
see y'all
Thanks.
later.
Have a good one.
Bye.
You too.
Bye.